Would you believe me if I told you there was a fighter with only 7 professional fights and a record of 4-3 who was still able to accomplish what 99.9% of fighters could only dream of? Well, enter Nicco Montano. Nicco has had one of the strangest careers in UFC history, which included some of the highest of highs, but also some of the lowest of lows. And despite the very underwhelming 4-3 record and severely damaged fight reputation, Nicco Montano will forever have a place in the history books. But to set the table before we get into this wild ride of a career, we got to take things back to 2015 when women's MMA was looked at a completely different light than what it's looked at today. 2015 was probably when women's MMA peaked. Nowadays, whenever you see a women's fight on a pay-per-view card, you could just automatically hear the amount of eye rolls going on behind the screen of some of the people in the comment section. But in 2015, it looked like the women were running the show. They were headlining pay-per-views, selling out not just arenas but stadiums. They were breaking records. Women's MMA had completely taken the UFC by storm, and at UFC 193, women's MMA would take center stage in front of a sold-out, record-breaking crowd in Etihad Stadium. At the time, Ronda Rousey was Ronda Rousey. She was a bona fide superstar running the bantamweight division with an undefeated record of 12-0, and the much smaller women's strawweight division was being absolutely terrorized by Joanna Jędrzejczyk, who was like lightning in a bottle. And to make things even better, the UFC was exploding in popularity, as this was also peak Conor McGregor time, as at the time he was scheduled to take on Jose Aldo in their unification bout. So it's pretty safe to say the UFC was booming, and there couldn't be a better time for you to burst onto the MMA scene. Ronda Rousey and Holly Holm would have their fight and become one of the most talked about fights in UFC history. And just 6 days after this bombshell of a fight is when our main protagonist would make her professional MMA debut. Nicco Montano was successful in her professional debut and was able to TKO her opponent, but things wouldn't get off too hot as she would lose her second professional fight by split decision. This is where I should probably add in that Nicco Montano probably holds a record for the most canceled fights in MMA history, and you'll definitely see why later. But after this split decision loss, she was eager to make a quick turnaround, but was forced to wait a little bit longer than maybe she anticipated due to 2 of her bouts falling through. But 6 months later, she'll finally get back in the cage and win a unanimous decision, putting her record at 2-1. After this, she would get a chance to fight for a title in a smaller organization and also win that title by TKO, but then would suffer her second defeat shortly after. Despite coming off a loss, an opportunity came up that no fighter in her position could ever refuse. It was a tryout for the Ultimate Fighter Season 26. For this season, the UFC would be introducing its new women's flyweight division, and the winner of this season would be crowned the first ever UFC flyweight world champion. Nearly 50 women showed up for the tryout, but only the top 16 would be selected for the tournament. Of course, in those 16, Nicco Montano was selected, and on the show, they made this season much more of like a tournament-based competition, where ahead of time, the women were ranked based on their tryout evaluation as well as their fight experience, and ultimately, the number 1 seed would fight the number 16th seed, the number 2 seed would fight the number 15 seed, and so on and so forth. Eddie Alvarez selected Lauren Murphy, who happened to be the number 3 seed, so she was going to have to fight the number 14 seed, which goes to none other than our girl, Nicco Montano.
Girl, your time to shine. Let's go.
Lauren, I'm coming for you. I'm gonna get that win. It's gonna hurt.
Nicco is able to pull off the upset and win by unanimous decision. Next up, Nicco will have to face the number 6 seed Montana Stewart, who is coming off of a submission win in the first round.
Fighter, start moving. Stop.
And Nicco does it again, pulling off the upset, bloodying up and battering Stewart to a decision win. Now heading into the semifinals, she must face the number 2 seed and Invicta flyweight world champion Barb Honchak.
This should really be Barb's fight. She's the number 2 seed and has been very impressive so far.
My fight with Barb Honchak means that I've started from the bottom and now I'm here.
So Nicco's fighting Barb in the semis. Barb and her team have underestimated Nicco from day one mentally. Oh!
And against all the odds, she does it again. Another win, another upset, and now she will get the opportunity to not just fight for a world title, but also make history. She was scheduled to take on Sijara Eubanks, who was the number 12 seed and also strung together several upset victories en route to earning her way to the finals. But on the show, Sijara heavily struggled to make the 126-pound limit.
I told her straight up, I said, you're gonna cut your hair. You told me you were gonna make this, so cut your hair. So she cut her freaking hair.
So having to cut that extra pound and trying to make 125 pounds for a world title proved to be too strenuous on her body. And while cutting weight, Sijara experienced kidney failure, forcing her to withdraw from the fight. As we all know, in this business, as one door closes, another one opens, and Roxanne Modafferi was ready to step in on short notice.
Winner of the Ultimate Fighter Season 26, and now UFC Flyweight Champion of the World, fighting out of Albuquerque, New Mexico,
Nicco did it. She not only wins the toughest tournament in all of sports, but she also makes history and becomes the UFC's first women's flyweight world champion. But this is where things would take a turn, and I mean a big turn for the worse. The type of turn that would absolutely ruin her reputation in the eyes of many fans who started calling her the worst champion in UFC history. And it all began when she was scheduled for her first title defense and pinned against the absolute monster in Valentina Shevchenko. Shevchenko wasn't just your average women's flyweight fighter. She was so good, she was fighting up a weight class at bantamweight against girls much bigger than her, and was not just competitive but dominant, and was the only fighter that even came close to defeating Amanda Nunes. People wanted to see Valentina fight for the belt shortly after Nicco beat Roxanne, but injuries and illnesses kept Nicco away from the cage and kept delaying the official fight date. Because of this, there were already rumors circling that Nicco Montano was afraid of Valentina Shevchenko, and people were questioning if Nicco was even going to defend the belt at all. It took a total of 8 months before the fight was even officially announced, and since Valentina was forced to wait so long, many people were already calling and considering Valentina Shevchenko as the flyweight champion.
Valentina, if I could, I want to ask you, and a lot of people I think are kind of looking at this fight as a foregone conclusion, that you're the champion in waiting.
There were tons of people who even predicted that Nicco would find a way to pull out of their fight.
She has one thing repeatedly she said in the lead-up to this, that she doubts whether you'll show up on Saturday. Where do you feel like that's coming from?
She lives in La La Land. I don't know, she's her weight cut brain.
But to their surprise, come fight week, Nicco showed up and seemed ready and confident. So it seemed like this fight was going down after all. However, this didn't last very long because the day before the fight, Nicco was hospitalized for issues related to weight cutting, which included kidney problems and an imbalance in electrolytes. Normally when something like this happens, a fighter is most likely within like a pound or 2 of the contracted weight, and their body just has such a hard time shedding off that very last bit. But what's interesting about this case is that Nicco wasn't anywhere near the 125-pound limit. So of course this infuriated fans, Valentina, and the UFC, who subsequently stripped her of the title. Hell, Valentina even believes she planned this from the very beginning.
Main thing that I was talking about this from very beginning when I signed first my boat agreement, and I told that she can pull out from the fight in any moment. And for me, I think it was her plan from very beginning, like to show up for the fight week, to build up her name, to speak with all media very confident about the fight, and in very last moment to try to find the reason to avoid this fight. And she did.
Nicco of course stated that it was not intentional and that she would still like to fight Valentina sometime in the future. Spoiler alert, it would never happen, because after this Nicco would actually move up to bantamweight instead, where she was then scheduled to take on Sarah McMahon. Sarah ends up having to pull out due to an injury, so Juliana Pena steps in on short notice and ends up beating Nicco by unanimous decision. And this is where Nicco might hold the record for the most consecutive cancellations in UFC history. Nicco was supposed to fight Macy Chiasson in February of 2020, but Nicco had to pull out due to an injury. Then later that year in August of 2020, she was matched up against Julia Avila, but the fight was pushed back due to Nicco's coach testing positive for COVID, because now we're in the chaos that was the pandemic. So then the bout was rescheduled for September of 2020, but was postponed a second time due to Nicco testing positive for COVID, and then was rescheduled for a third time for October 2020, but Montano had to pull out yet again due to travel restrictions. In February of 2021, Nicco was set to fight Carol Rosa, but Nicco was not medically cleared to compete, so she had to pull out from that fight also. Well, that makes 5 in a row. Do I hear 6? In July of 2021, Nicco didn't test positive for COVID. She was medically cleared by doctors to fight, and there were no major injuries that prevented her from fighting, so what could possibly have gone wrong this time? Well, despite moving up in weight class, Nicco Montano missed weight by 7 pounds, and on the scale, it looked like she didn't even try. The weight miss was just way too high, and the bout was ultimately scrapped. Would you even believe that these are the same exact fighters? She looks like she's just there for a check and doesn't even care or want to fight anymore. After the severe weight miss, Nicco Montano took to Instagram where she would say she did everything in her power to try to make the weight, but of course fans did not believe her. And it seemed like the promotion may have had their doubts also, because shortly after she was released from the UFC, making it 6 fight cancellations in a row and 11 cancellations total in her pro career. Yes, she's had more canceled fights than actual fights. Some of them were out of her hands, they weren't her fault. And some people might even argue that none of them were really her fault. But this is a business at the end of the day, and there's only so many amount of times that you can call out of work before your boss just fires you. After release from the UFC, Nicco Montano appears to have retired. She never officially made an announcement or an official statement about it, probably due to the amount of backlash she's received throughout her UFC career. I also remember seeing something shortly after her release where she was hospitalized after being violently assaulted by some guy. And yep, I was able to find it. Here it is, ex-UFC champ Nicco Montano. I was a victim in violent assault. In this report, Nicco said that her face was stomped on and that she was repeatedly kicked in the head during a violent attack at an Austin hotel. She says, "Tonight he stood on my neck and stomped on my face and then kept kicking me and shoving my hair into his fist and the corner of the bed frame. I got away for a second to run down the hall naked, screaming for my life as he tried to drag me back by my hair. Luckily, someone from the hotel heard my screams and came to my rescue." The alleged attacker was Justin Watson, who was a former NFL football player. Of course, Justin Watson later would come to social media and say that there's always 2 sides to every story, and says that cops were involved, they investigated the situation, and in the end, nobody was arrested. Apparently, all this happened after a night out drinking, and Nicco Montano may not have been completely sober, so at the end of the day, only they know what really happened that night. But to this day, she continues to proudly and fully embrace her Navajo Native American roots, and appears like she still occasionally trains in jiu-jitsu while working for a general contractor corporation where they pave roads in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But without a doubt, her career is one of the strangest in UFC history, because if I told you there's a fighter with only 7 fights with a record of 4 and 3 and has had nearly double the amount of canceled fights as actual fights, there's no way you would think that they not only won the Ultimate Fighter but became the UFC champion. But that is and was the crazy career of Nicco Montano.